makers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London with the conversations that matter, and here's what's coming up on today's program. President Joe Biden has just touched down in Israel with tensions high after an explosion at a Gaza hospital killed hundreds of people, while Hamas and Israel trade blame. Elsewhere, the pound gains after inflation in the UK proves stickier than expected, leaving open the possibility of a further rate hike from the Bank of England. And we also look at technology with ASML orders there plunging in the third quarter amid a sector-wide slump in the semiconductor industry. Now, we're looking at live pictures of Air Force One. Of course, the President of the United States of America just about to get off the plane, greeted by the Prime Minister of Israel. Now, he's landed in Israel hours after an explosion at a hospital in Gaza killed hundreds and threatened to plunge the region into chaos. Now, the blast did draw condemnation from Arab governments who blamed Israel and will complicate U.S. efforts to contain the conflict. There is the president descending the steps of Air Force One. We did hear from Israel that it has evidence that the blast was a result of a failed attack by Islamic Jihad. Hamas designated a terrorist group by the U.S. and Europe, blamed an Israel strike. When you look at how important today will be, of course, between the two leaders, what kind of tone and messaging, we'll also look at body language to see what the president wants to actually convey. This extremely important time. Now, earlier, President Biden didn't say he was outraged and also deeply saddened, and that he'd ask his national security team to continue gathering information about what exactly happened. Now, he has arrived in Tel Aviv moments ago. I guess the first thing he'll try and do is try and seek to salvage his high-stakes diplomatic endeavor. Again, this is after this deadly explosion at a Gaza hospital, threatening to plunge the Middle East into chaos. We will see how he's greeted by the Israeli Prime Minister and a lot of officials there. We've heard from the Gaza Health Ministry that the explosion yesterday killed at least 500 people, which it blamed on an Israeli strike. So we have to wait for the facts to see exactly what happened. We also know that a lot of the Arab countries have decided they'd rather speak on the phone with President Biden rather than actually be there in person. We will follow all of the various, what the president will do. We know he has various engagements. We'll see whether that changes or not. So let's get the latest from Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Tel Aviv, who I think is standing by very close to where the president has just landed. So, Ollie, what does this mean? What does it mean for President Biden's Middle East mission?
That's right. This is a completely different trip than it was planned to be yesterday when you wake up today in the situation that Biden is arriving into. If originally there were three goals for the president to achieve here, the first being support for Israel, the second being deterrence from other actors. You know, we have two aircraft fleets from the United States in the Eastern Mediterranean, 2,000 troops apparently on high alert. And then the third, which is arguably the most difficult and the most important, which was the question of diplomacy. So right here in central Tel Aviv, there is a huge amount of press. There's a huge amount of security. As we saw, the president has just arrived. We expect him to hold meetings with Israeli leadership as well as Antony Blinken. But what is going to be critically missing for this trip now is the second leg of it. It was supposed to begin in Israel and then go into Jordan, where he was supposed to meet with the president El-Sisi of Egypt, the King Abdullah of Jordan, but as well the Palestinian Authority president that presides over the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas. That part of the trip has been canceled now due to this blast at the hospital, and it's an intensely difficult trip for Biden before this, and it makes it even more complicated now. And there are a number of issues that have yet to be unresolved. The namely perhaps, is the aid that is still sitting on the southern border of Gaza with Egypt.
So Oliver, what more do we actually know about the hospital explosion?
So what we've been told by the Gazan health authorities is that 500 people were killed. That would put the death toll well above 3,000, which was already approaching late in the day yesterday. We know that all of the hospitals are already way overstretched, fully packed, so this is particularly devastating. There has been universal condemnation, but there has not been universal attribution. So a number of countries, neighboring countries, whether Egypt, Turkey, UAE, Saudi, have all criticized Israel, the United States, and many of the European European leaders to say we need more information to figure out what happened. Netanyahu has said that this was not an Israeli target. The IDF has been putting out videos all morning suggesting that this was actually a failed rocket by Islamic Jihad. But again, it is very hard to tell at this stage, and is, as you can imagine, an intensely sensitive subject, particularly since in the wake of this yesterday, we saw a large number of protests across a number of neighboring countries, which only turns up the temperature in what is already a very challenging situation.
Ollie, thanks so much. Oliver Kirk there, live for us in Tel Aviv. Now, we're looking, of course, at the political fallout of this as tensions go high, what it means longer term for the economy in the Middle East following the Gaza hospital blast. So this is exactly what we'll be talking about shortly. If you look at some of the implications, of course, over this longer term, it could have implications for inflation. It also has huge implications for not only the diplomacy of it, but we always and foremost think about humanitarian crisis. Joining us now to talk about longer-term implication of economics, Beata Manthey, global equity strategist at Citigroup, Global Markets, and Tina Fordham, geopolitical strategist, advisor and founder of Fordham Global Foresight. So thank you both for joining us. Tina, everything's changed in the last 10 days. Everything seems to have changed in terms of diplomacy over the last 24 hours. What is Biden hoping to achieve by going to Israel?
First and foremost, Biden needs to de-escalate this conflict. The hospital blast overnight is devastating in humanitarian terms, and the fact that it's unattributed is problematic, of course, but it underscores the extent to which innocent civilians are caught up in this conflict. And what the U.S. does not want is widening internationalization of the conflict at the same time as we have a war in Ukraine.
How, Tina, will he be able actually to de-escalate these extremely high tensions?
It's probably the biggest challenge of his presidency to do so. The stakes are incredibly high from a geopolitical perspective. Emotions are running high, and that pours gasoline on the flames. It's going to take all of his diplomatic efforts. Biden, of course, has been in high office for decades, but his relationship with Netanyahu has always been strained, and he's working with Arab governments who are mistrustful of the role of the United States. And the fact that King Abdullah of Jordan canceled the summit is evidence of that. That's an extraordinary move for a Middle Eastern partner of the United States to take.
You know, we also heard from the Egyptian president, Mr. El-Sisi, saying he was talking about moving Palestinians to Sinai, saying it makes it a base for opposition. And actually, he's, for the moment, said that that's not something that he's really considering. If you look at some of the key allies or key countries that the U.S. needs on side, where do you put China? Where do you put Egypt? Where do you put Saudi?
So this is really important because remember when China had a role in brokering the normalization pact between Saudi Arabia and Iran, we had a lot of news flow about China's role in the Middle East. Well, we have since heard barely a squeak out of Beijing, apart from fairly tepid condemnation or criticism of Hamas. We see that as much as the United States has tried to wind down or, reduce its role in the Middle East, it keeps getting pulled back. As you mentioned, El-Sisi, the Egyptians, they don't want to take the Palestinians. Jordan already has its own share of this. So there are very few options apart from de-escalation and some sort of ceasefire.
And Beata, of course, away from this, into your world, when you look at how the markets have been reacting, they've been pretty much range-bound. So there's, concern, volatility, but then very quickly goes back to normalization.
So it's very hard to talk about the market reaction, given the scale of human tragedy. But what tends to happen, the immediate translation mechanism into the markets is, of course, the oil price. We've seen that, and the strength in the dollar. So that hasn't played out that much yet. And probably it wasn't a very intuitive reaction of the markets for some market participants last week that, as you've mentioned, they've moved range-bound. Well, what has performed very well within the market is, of course, energy stocks and aerospace and defense, so that's quite logical. But in terms of the resilience, if you can call it this way, of the markets. I think one factor is the fact that actually we've entered the beginning of the conflict just after equity markets have had a meaningful correction, right? So there was less exuberance on the top of the market. And at the end of the day, the markets are in a wait-and-see mode, on alert, but trying to figure out what that means eventually for the fundamentals and for earnings.
So, Beata, you don't think this is fundamentally because either they can't price it or because they're not expecting an escalation?
So we don't know. There are lots of uncertainties, and this is why the market has been range-bound in the wait-and-see mode. But definitely there are huge risks around.
Tina, compared to 24 hours ago, is there a bigger risk now of this escalating?
Absolutely. You know, the human civilian toll is an emotional accelerant to the conflict, and market participants shouldn't underestimate that. I mean, Beata is quite right that it takes a lot for a geopolitical risk to actually transmit into equity markets, which is why we see it a little bit in oil prices. But I can't say strongly enough, in the 25 years that I've been covering geopolitics and its impact on markets, we have never had so many risk factors at play.
Thank you both for joining us. Tina Fordham and Beata Manthey both stay with us. We'll have, of course, more on geopolitics after the break as the U.S. president has touched down in Tel Aviv. This is Bloomberg.
I call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to provide sufficient time and space to help realize my two appeals and to ease the epic human suffering we are witnessing. Too many lives and the fate of the entire region hang on the balance.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calling for an immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas conflict. Let's bring our panel back. Tina Fordham, geopolitical strategist at Fordham Global Foresight. Beata Manthey, a global equity strategist at Citigroup Global Markets. We also have the president, of course, Joe Biden, the U.S. president, arriving just minutes ago in Israel and Tel Aviv. He was greeted by the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and then he has a full day, of course, of events that he needs to attend. Tina, also, congratulations. You have a new job in briefing, right, the LSE, so briefing markets participants about some of these geopolitical risks. Now, there was an understanding, and I don't know whether it was erroneous or not, that U.S. diplomacy was going to calm things, right, until at least the president would arrive in Tel Aviv. Has it all really gone wrong?
The lack of trust in international relations is really evident here. The U.S. is not trusted as a partner to negotiations. The role of the UN is minimal. And, of course, the parties in the Middle East and the Gulf are not necessarily all on the same page. But what they will agree on is the need to stop the bloodshed, and that is the critical thing. The fact that the president has turned up in person is truly remarkable. And underscores the absence of another serious partner, but all sides are going to likely hold out.
Vladimir Putin is also meeting the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. China has remained fairly quiet, as you were saying. Do they need to start acting more on the international stage?
I'm not sure China has the credibility in the Middle East, right? Because if you look at what kind of expectations there have been from China, it's been China as a commercial partner in the Middle East and the United States as a security and defense partner. That's what Saudi Arabia wanted when it was in the midst of negotiating this deal to normalize relations with Israel, which is now obviously on the back burner. But it's very difficult for China, Russia to pursue their agenda in an environment of total chaos.
And Beata, we're hearing, of course, of incidents outside Gaza. And so when you look at possible escalation, extremely difficult, of course, to speculate at this moment. If you're a market participant, you look at the price of oil. There's also been, in the past, Iran saying they could close the Strait of Hormuz, which would have significant economic impacts. Is that worst-case scenario?
Absolutely. So oil is something that everybody is watching very closely, and of course it has translation for what happens on the inflation front and ultimately economy, right? So Citi economists estimate that around $10 higher oil over a sustainable period of time adds around 20-25 basis points to inflation. So these, if the situation continues, of course, it will have impact.
And because this, of course, is playing out also on social media with some things that are not verified, but it's playing out really on social media, does it automatically have an impact on business confidence, on consumer confidence, and actually just how people behave?
So what I would argue, the confidence has been already quite weak over the summer, especially because of what has been happening in China and the rate environment around the world. So we've entered that crisis with quite subdued sentiment, which we've been arguing away from geopolitical risks could have been at an inflection point of improving, right? So the fact that it's been quite bearish in a way is also helping.
I mean, we're also hearing the UK, for example, UK inflation staying higher than expected after the jump in oil prices, and it really, has offset some of the downward pressure for some of the food costs. How complicated is it for a small economy like the UK to set rates in this uncertain environment?
It's very complicated. So until yesterday, we thought that Bank of England was going to be on hold. The same for all the other major central banks. So that was a good news for the markets that we are done with the rate hikes. But of course, we know central banks are data dependent. So any big surprises to the upside, they'll be thinking about the risks.
So do you think central banks will be in a little bit of a void? I was in Marrakesh for the IMF World Bank meetings last week, and again, everyone was looking at some of the horrific news flow without really being able to analyze, react, or actually see what this means longer term.
I think it's not only going to be the inflation factor that pushes them to make any monetary decisions, right? They are weighing all the risks around, so it's they have a complicated job ahead.
Tina, do you think we'll get is a ceasefire on the cards? Is it something that you think President Biden will ask the Israel Prime Minister?
I think that's the imperative for all parties will be an unconditional ceasefire, yes. Anything other than that is going to be a match to the fire. We're going to be talking about a lot worse than, rates being higher for longer if they fail in their diplomatic efforts.
Thank you both for joining us. Of course, panel, of course, looking at the implications of this human tragedy and the impact on the economy. Tina Fordham at Fordham Global Foresight and Beata Manthey at Citigroup Global Markets. Coming up, Country Garden is on the brink of its first default in China, saying it's unlikely to honor offshore payments on time. We'll have plenty more on that story next. And this is Bloomberg. The conversations that matter, the insights you need. This is The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, distressed Chinese developer Country Garden says it is unlikely to honor all offshore debt payments on time, signaling it's set for its first ever default. Bloomberg's Rebecca Chung-Wilkins joins us now from Hong Kong. So, Rebecca, what exactly is the latest on Country Garden?
Yeah, so we're coming to the end of that 30-day grace period. We're expecting that to end today. And as you say, the overall expectation, particularly after that Country Garden statement, is that it is going to default. It'll be its first default on a public bond offshore. And while this has been the expectation for some time, the bonds have traded well below 10 cents on the dollar in deep distressed territory through this month. It is an important sort of data point to see a firm like Country Garden struggle in this way. It's an important marker, really, of where we are in the distress cycle for China property too. I mean, at one point this was the largest property firm in China, and it's not an Evergrande. By comparison, this is a firm that's borrowed much more responsibly. It didn't expand into a conglomerate buying all sorts of kind of unrelated industries, and it's still a very, very big player in China. It employs around 60,000 people, 3,000 outstanding projects, and 186 billion in liabilities. So the consequences, even though they are expected, are really significant. And it is disappointing, I think, for China, which has tried so hard to try and bottom out the crisis more broadly, to still be seeing a failure of this sort.
Rebecca, on the economy, of course, all eyes on President Biden, who's just touched down in Tel Aviv. A wider conflict could endanger crude flows. We also have the president of Russia meeting with the Chinese president. And then we had data out of China today, better than expected, but not enough to lift concerns about the nation's economic outlook.
Yeah, I think in terms of data, as you say, better than expected. So GDP in the third quarter coming out at 4.9%, really off the back of the Chinese consumer apparently somewhat back. So we saw retail sales also beating expectations at 5.5%. Looks like people are willing to spend on everything from alcohol, cars, restaurants again. The real drag, though, just touching back on Country Garden, is that issue over property. We saw disappointing sales again, 9.1% drop through September. So that is the real prevailing concern for China.
Rebecca, thank you so much. Rebecca Wilkins in Hong Kong. The U.S. President Joe Biden just landed in Israel hours after an explosion at a hospital in Gaza killed hundreds and threatened to plunge the region into chaos. President Joe Biden has touched down in Israel with tensions high after an explosion at a Gaza hospital killed hundreds of people. Hamas and Israel trade blame. Elsewhere, the pound gains after inflation in the UK proves stickier than expected, leaving open the possibility of a further rate hike from the Bank of England. Plus, shares fall in ASML after orders plunge in the third quarter amid a sector-wide slump in the semiconductor industry. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. So the U.S. President Joe Biden has arrived in Israel. It comes as hundreds of people have been killed in an explosion at a Gaza City hospital, according to officials in the Hamas-controlled territory. Now, the Palestinian Authority and countries including Jordan, Egypt, and Turkey have blamed Israel.
What happened tonight is a great tragedy and a horrifying war massacre that cannot be ignored or allowed to pass without accountability. This aggression against our people must stop, and these crimes must come to an end.
Israel denies responsibility, with the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, posting on X, formerly known as Twitter, "The entire world should know it was a barbaric terrorist in Gaza that attacked the hospital in Gaza and not the IDF." Meanwhile, Egypt has rejected any attempt to move Palestinians into Sinai, saying it would create a base for the opposition. EU leaders have also condemned the deadly strike on the Gaza hospital. Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo is in Brussels. So, Maria, how have EU leaders been responding to the hospital blast, and will it make a real difference?
Yes, Francine, good morning. And look, the mood today in Brussels among the European institutions is that risks in this region are now manifesting and really manifesting greatly. They also note, of course, that explosion in the hospital that took place yesterday has really changed the mood this morning. And in fact, speaking of that today, the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, spoke before the European Parliament. And now she talks about the fury of war that has been unleashed on civilians, repeating that they have to be protected. The pictures, she says, coming out of Gaza are now horrifying, and the world needs to take note. Let's take a look.
The scenes from Al-Ali Hospital are horrifying and distressing. There is no excuse for hitting a hospital full of civilians. All facts need to be established, and those responsible must be held accountable. In this tragic hour, we must all redouble our efforts to protect civilians from the fury of this war.
And that was Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the Commission. As you noted, Francine, she talks about an investigation, finding out who is behind this. But she also says the terror has been unleashed by Hamas. The world should not lose sight of that. She notes that has triggered this new spiral of violence between Israel and Palestine. But she is very clear there needs to be an investigation to figure out and find out what happens here. But as I see, the mood this morning is almost that this region is now almost at breaking point.
Maria, is the EU, with their connections, trying to get support of de-escalation from China or elsewhere in the world?
Yes, and Francine, that's an excellent question because we know that behind the scenes there has been a flurry now of calls between European officials, also Arab leaders. We know also yesterday Olaf Scholz was in Israel. We know too, or should note, that Emmanuel Macron has noted that he is planning on visiting the region if there's a specific agenda that he can work with. And also on that note, on top of the condemnation to this blast in the hospital, the French president this morning once again repeated there needs to be humanitarian corridors and they need to open without delay. And Francine, that is a huge point of tension at this point because it comes down to Egypt. It's the Egyptians that hold the key to one of the main corridors that could open. What I'm being told, however, from European leaders involved, European officials in conversations like this, is that the Egyptians really feel there could be a mass exodus of people. So they worry about the numbers, but they worry too that this could be a permanent move. So what I'm being told is that for the time being, the Egyptians are almost overwhelmed at the prospect of a mass exodus of people.
And Maria, at the same time, it's very clear that last week, after the start of this horrific war, Europe was not speaking on the same page, right? Leaders had their own thoughts. Have they now come together and speak with a stronger voice? And have they been much more firm with Israel?
Yes, and Francine, as you know, a lot of this started a real political storm, not just in Brussels, but really across Europe. It has to do mainly focused on that visit by von der Leyen to Israel. The criticism there was that she seemed almost too one-sided, that she did not talk about the humanitarian issues, that she did not talk about the civilians. We see this morning that she is, to some extent, correcting that note, saying that civilians have to be protected. She talks about the fire and the fury of war on civilians that has to stop. She says, having said that, what she repeats, and I'm being told she believes it's her duty to say, is that the responsibility of all of this starts with that terror attack in Israel, and it comes down to Hamas. So it is a difficult, sometimes diplomatic act for the European Union to sound very strongly on those terms, to support the Israeli people, which obviously they want, but also be diplomatic on the idea that civilians who are not to blame for this have been put on the line. So it's a diplomatic threat at times that's complicated for the European Union, on top of the fact that we know there are real tensions at times between the different personalities and institutions. Having said that, I was told yesterday that now when you look at the European Council and the European Commission, there is less tension, and it is clear now to everyone that they need to coordinate better and work together over the next days and probably weeks.
Maria, thanks so much. Maria Tadeo there in Brussels. Now let's also get straight to Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, who's in Tel Aviv, where just moments ago, about 30 minutes ago, the President of the United States touched down in Tel Aviv. What are we expecting from this diplomatic mission?
That's right, Francine. Well, we're expecting an awful lot less than we were expecting about 12 hours ago, before that hospital blast that we had overnight. What we were hoping from Biden and expecting from Biden is for him to arrive in Tel Aviv as the first part of a two-part trip and then go over to Jordan. That second part of the trip has now been canceled. So we're in central Tel Aviv, where we expect the president to arrive any moment now. He will be meeting with Antony Blinken, who is here already, of course, and the Israeli leadership. And again, his purpose here was threefold. One is to show the unflinching support for Israel, which is the position that has been espoused by every single U.S. delegate who has arrived in Israel. The second is a question of deterrence on other actors to get involved. We see that with 2 aircraft carrier groups moving to the Eastern Mediterranean, 2,000 American troops on high alert. And of course, the third, which is arguably the most important, is the diplomatic side of this, right? Is trying to bring in other leaders from the region into the discussion, trying to get aid into Gaza, but also trying to de-escalate the situation and work the back channels there. That part of the trip, arguably the most important, has now been scuppered. He was supposed to go to Jordan to meet the president of Egypt, El-Sisi, the president of the Palestinian Authority that presides over the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas, and also with the King of Jordan, and they have canceled the trip after that blast. And of course, that complicates a situation for Biden, which is already almost impossible.
Oliver, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook there, of course, live in Tel Aviv. We'll continue to bring you the latest from President Biden's visit to Israel, the Middle East, and, of course, the reaction of countries that have decided that they will not meet with the president. This is Bloomberg. The conversations that matter, the insights you need. This is The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the Open Society Barometer, a study of global public opinion on democracy across 30 countries, finds the majority of respondents fear violence due to political unrest. Democracy remains popular across the globe, but the poll found lower levels of support amongst young people as the world faces multiple challenges and patchy evidence that democracies are improving the lives of their citizens. Well, joining us now is Malloch-Brown. He's the president of Open Society Foundations. He's also former UN Deputy Secretary General. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Malloch-Brown, when you look at the horrific events that have been unfolding and the serious risk of escalation in it, what does it mean for the world, actually, for the world of geopolitics and possibly democracies across the world?
Well, I think for democracies, it's quite a rebuke in a way. It's a validation of the importance of people being allowed a say in their governance and future. But, you know, what this indicates is a place where that had entirely broken down. Nothing excuses the horrendous, inhuman attacks on Israeli civilians. But, you know, Gaza is an area which feels it has no political future, and that has led to this, you know, violent challenge to the status quo, both in the Middle East, but by implication more broadly. And that's where, you know, in a sense, the case for democracy is more at risk, which is, this is a poll that shows that people everywhere still prefer democracy as a preferred form of government, but are increasingly dubious about can it deliver. And, you know, I think one of the threats it faces immediately is the world dividing in a kind of post 9/11 way between the West and the rest. And, you know, I know President Biden's trip was intended to head that off, but of course, he's now got real headwinds.
Mark, we're also looking at pictures of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. We're following what he's saying. He's with the U.S. President Joe Biden, who's arrived in Israel about 40 minutes ago. How incredible, actually, is it to see an 80-year-old president being flown in places where there's war? What does it mean for the need of de-escalation? And actually, what do you think the President Biden needs to do today? Is it a complete ceasefire? How does he de-escalate this?
Well, it's a brave and ambitious step, and of course has been, you know, why has he done it? Because he felt that his years of credit with Israel as a staunch defender of Israel in his years in the Senate, but equally his long relationships with King Abdullah of Jordan and others would allow him a kind of to apply his empathy and listening to find a way to de-escalate this. And now, of course, he's a mission which has lost one of its legs because there is no visit to Jordan or meeting with the Arab leaders. So that sort of empathetic diplomacy is now fatally damaged, really, and hobbling. It's as I say, it's missing a leg, and that is going to be a real challenge, because there is a good reason why, even if you go back to the Yom Kippur War, it wasn't President Nixon or President Ford who flew out in that period. It was the National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and every other time since, it's been secretaries of state who've really taken the strain on this, because you kind of want to keep the president back, protected from the very unpredictable nature of Middle East diplomacy, and allow them to bless a deal once it happens at Camp David or the White House. So this is Biden plunging in, and it's brave, and given the terrible situation, important, but I have to say the odds of success are not great, and there is a real risk that the moment he leaves the region, the conflict intensifies, and that's then laid at his door, that he somehow blessed it. So it's a challenging mission.
Mark, there was this massive bombing at a Gaza city hospital, which killed at least 500 people. And again, it's led to Israel and Hamas trading blame for the attack. What's the probability of this significantly escalating? We already see tensions in the region that could intensify. Where does this end?
Well, it's Obviously, the first consequence was the cancellation of the meeting with the Arab leaders. There is a Security Council resolution in New York, which people hope would go through today. It now looks in a pretty parlous place because of this attack. You know, what I hope is that people can just, you know, be level-headed enough to wait for some credible international investigation of why this happened. Was it an IDF attack, or was it, as the Israelis claim, you know, a rocket from the Palestinian side which went rogue and misfired? And, you know, it doesn't take away from the fact that when you fight in confined civilian spaces, and after all, you know, Gaza is half the size of New York City, you know, when you're sort of promoting war in that kind of context, huge civilian-based accidents of this kind are going to happen. So, you know, whoever was responsible and kind of pulled the trigger, behind that is the wider lesson that you know, conflicts of this kind will have massive civilian consequences and always be likely in breach of international humanitarian law.
Yeah. The President of the United States has just started speaking again. He's just said that actually the U.S. stands with Israel. He had condemned about 12 hours ago what happened at the hospital in Gaza. And as you say, on the back of that, Arab leaders in Turkey reacted with outrage. Jordan and the Palestinian Authority, which governs the West Bank, canceled the summit scheduled for Wednesday in the Jordanian capital of Amman with Biden, or at least that the president was meant to attend. The next 24 hours marks extremely crucial. Can China step in? Do they want to step in? Do they have the clout to make a difference?
Well, you know, China, of course, is still basking in having achieved a bit of a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, a renewal of diplomatic relations. So it's become the default alternative in the region. And I think if it was to throw its weight in with the US to try and find a solution, it would be very, very powerful. But, you know, at the moment, China and Russia in the Security Council, at least, you know, are looking for an equivalency which does not acknowledge that this began with the brutal Hamas attack on civilians and which calls for an immediate ceasefire, while the American position and that of Western countries is there is an Israeli right of military response against Hamas, which must be preserved, even at the same time that civilians are protected. So, you know, the two sides are, you know, far apart on the essentials of a way forward. And, you know, I think the fact is both sides need to take stock. Both sides need to realize that, you know, ultimately, whatever the feelings and blood running at the moment, ultimately there has to be a political solution, not to the Hamas crimes, but to the status of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank.
Mark, the $25 billion international network of foundations started by George Soros, which you're currently running, has shuttered closed offices around the world. It's preparing to cut more than 40% of its staff. Do you worry that it will be much more difficult after that to have well-functioning democracies around the world?
No, quite the opposite, actually, because, you know, this is not because of any kind of financial need to do it. It's all about, you know, what's the most efficient model of delivering really sharp programs which are going to be effective in protecting human rights and democracy. And the reductions and shuttering of offices actually does not reduce our geographic footprint. We are the one foundation in the world which prides ourselves on, you know, genuinely as much as possible global presence.
Mark, let's just listen in. The president, of course, also saying, the U.S. President Joe Biden saying he's deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital. He had said that about 10 hours ago, saying that the explosion appears done by the other team, not you. So this is just the latest, I think, as that short press conference or short comments to the press is just wrapping up. But Mark, thank you so much. Mark Malloch-Brown, the president of Open Society Foundations and former UN Deputy Secretary General. Of course, we know, but a good reminder, OSF is the charity founded by billionaire George Soros. This is Bloomberg. U.S. President Joe Biden has arrived in Israel. It comes after hundreds of people were killed in an explosion at a hospital in Gaza City, with Hamas and Israel trading blame over who was responsible for the blast. Let's get straight to our Bloomberg News Director for EMEA, Rosalind Matheson. Ros, you've been helping us make sense of all of this since the very beginning. Biden was just with the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, the U.S. president, saying that the explosion appears done by the other team, not you. So he was saying this, Netanyahu, so saying that this was not their rocket. Of course, this is not the side of other people in the region. Behind closed door, would he be saying another message, or is there still unwavering support for Israel?
Well, certainly the US is a very direct ally of Israel, and there is strong support for Israel in this moment. Remembering, of course, this began because Hamas attacked Israel, killing many Israeli civilians, and there's a sense in the US they've got to support Israel in this moment. They're sending military aid. Certainly the presence of Joe Biden now on the ground there is meant to reinforce that message, but also there's that rising sense of concern that things are really starting to spiral out of control. We've got desperate scenes in Gaza, humanitarian scenes there. Now we've got this hospital blast. We have Arab nations in the region. Their rhetoric is becoming much more heated. We've got concern that Iran gets drawn in. So certainly behind the scenes in those conversations, it will probably be not questioning Netanyahu and whether they still want to proceed with the ground war, but certainly cautioning about the risks involved.
So Arab leaders in Turkey reacted with outrage at this blast at the hospital. They cancelled a meeting scheduled in Amman. Does this escalate? I mean, is there anything, actually, that anything can do for tensions to cool off? Is it a complete ceasefire that would even be floated?
Well, right now it's very hard to know what could help this to de-escalate, because positions, if anything, are just hardening. We're seeing, of course, protests outside Israeli embassies and other offices in the region. So those views are really hardening. And the fact that this meeting with the US president got called off makes it even more complicated. They're just refusing to meet with him in this minute. So what kind of back channels can be going on to try and calm this situation down? We know there's a lot of back channeling going on. The US has said publicly they're talking to Iran behind the scenes to de-escalate. But certainly the images on the ground in Gaza, the worsening situation in there, really seems to be hardening those views.
Why? Why hardening of views? Is it public display?
Well, certainly it's just the reality that for many people going back who've lived in Gaza, the situation for them has been quite poor for many years. It's a high-density area. They've had poor quality of living, little access sometimes to work. Now they've got questions about access to drinkable water, food, medicine and so on. You know, for Israel saying they've got to move south very quickly ahead of a potential ground invasion. And so the collateral of that, the concerns about that are rising. And so that's really the key question now.
Ros, thanks so much. Ros Matheson. We continue, of course, our coverage. President Joe Biden in Israel with tensions extremely high after an explosion at a Gaza hospital that killed hundreds of people.